Good afternoon, everyone, and mostly good afternoon. I think a few places it might still be morning. I'm Susan Golonka. I'm the Acting Director of the Office of Family Assistance at the Administration for Children and Families, and I want to welcome all of you today to our Pandemic Emergency Assistance Fund webinar with a particular focus on how these funds can be accessed and used by tribal TANF programs. We're excited to have this opportunity and to have this fund available for all of our tribal TANF programs, because it will provide an extra amount of money to really help families who are experiencing immediate and deep needs as a result of the pandemic. It's a time-limited fund, and with some fairly explicit ways it can be used. But we think it's really a critical resource, and we want to help you in every way we can to use these funds. To that end, we are committed to getting the funds out to you as quickly as possible and to providing you information and answering all your questions that might emerge along the way. So with that, I will turn it over to Stan Koutstaal, who is our Director of Tribal TANF Management and Regional Operations. And he will lead you through the substance and probably also give you a few instructions around how we're going to receive questions and that sort of thing. So thank you all for joining us today, and I hope this is helpful to you.
Good afternoon and good morning to everybody. My name is Stan Koutstaal, and it's my pleasure to be with you today. Also with us, who you can see, is Deborah List, and I'll just mention her name. She works in the Office of the Director with Susan, and she will be providing some assistance to field questions that come in. And so I'll just say a word now about questions. We're going to spend the first portion of this webinar just reviewing some information about the Pandemic Emergency Assistance Fund, and then we'll spend a little bit of time responding to questions that we've received via the chat box. So along the way, if there's a question that emerges for you, please feel free to enter it there. And at the conclusion of my initial presentation, there will be time devoted to responding to the questions that are entered into the chat box. And then we'll also allow some time to open up the microphones so that everybody can verbally ask questions or provide comments if they so choose. And with that, when we get to that point, people will just want to be mindful that there can be a lot of background noise. And so if you don't have an immediate question, you will likely want to voluntarily mute your phone at that point. But for now, we're just going to jump into some information about the Pandemic Emergency Assistance Fund. And for many of you, you may be aware that this is not the first time that we've talked about the Pandemic Emergency Assistance Fund with tribes. It was on March 26th that we had a previous webinar, and that was done in conjunction with the Administration for Native Americans, also in ACF, as a part of a consultation process. And that was informative for where we are today. So let's go to the next slide. So today we sent out to tribes, and we also informed colleagues at BIA, and we also have posted to this webinar under handouts. You'll notice that there's an attachment, and I think that we also sent it out to everybody that registered for this webinar. Sort of a program instruction that's intended specifically for tribes that administer TANF through their 477 plan. And there has been sort of a significant change in our plans for approaching things, and that's the major headline. So I figured that's the place that we would start today. And so the first slide just sort of provides a summary of where we've been with that. On March 19th, we issued a Dear Tribal Leader letter, and that letter invited tribes to the consultation. The consultation itself was held on March 26th, and in the letter and on the webinar, we shared our view that the Pandemic Emergency Assistance Fund was not eligible for inclusion in 477, and that in proposing that and in sharing that intention, we heard strong and repeated concerns about our plans to engage 477 tribes directly rather than transferring funds through BIA. And as a result of that consultation, we reconsidered our approach, and we agree that because TANF is already a program approved for inclusion in a 477 plan, the Pandemic Emergency Assistance Funds will be transferred to BIA for tribes who are currently approved to integrate their TANF programs in a 477 plan. So I think that that's sort of the major headline. There are some caveats to that, and I'll try to share more information about pieces that are specific to 477 tribes as we go along. But for now, that's the major headline. So let's go to the next slide and just talk more broadly about the Pandemic Emergency Assistance Fund generally. So it was authorized by the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, which created a new section, 403C of the Social Security Act. So TANF is authorized by Section 403A, and so many of the things that apply to TANF also apply to the Pandemic Emergency Assistance Fund, although there are some points of distinction, but it is in the same section generally of the plan. And what it does is it sets aside $1 billion to assist needy families impacted by COVID-19. And the eligible entities for the funding include states in the District of Columbia, tribes that administer a TANF program, and 5 U.S. territories. So let's go to the next slide. And the law specifies that 7.5% of funds, so there's $1 billion in funding, and of that, $2 million is set aside for technical assistance activities, and that's specified in the law. And so 7.5% of the remainder of the $1 billion minus the $2 million is $74,850,000, and that is to be distributed among U.S. territories and tribes. So we proposed a method for making those allotments, and allotments are based on a tribe's or territory's existing share of the total TANF funds distributed to tribes and the territories, and it's a proportional distribution of current TANF funds among the tribes. And we shared our plans to do that as a part of the consultation, and that was one aspect of our plans for approaching the implementation of the funding that was actually received pretty well. And so those allotments were included in a table that were a part of a program instruction that have been sent to all tribes, both those that we fund directly and those that are funded through 477. So let's go to the next slide. So the act is very specific that the funds may only be used for certain non-recurrent short-term benefits as they are defined in the 196R. So the 196R is actually a financial reporting form that is used by states. And so it is kind of interesting that the law points to a very specific definition for non-recurrent short-term benefits that aligns with what is given in the regulations, but also narrows that definition in some ways. So let's review the similarities, but also the points that are specific to this particular funding. So a non-recurrent short-term benefit is designed to deal with a specific crisis situation or episode of need. It must not be intended to meet ongoing needs, and it must not extend beyond 4 months. One of the things that we've determined in relation to this particular funding is that all families have been subject to the COVID-19 crisis, and therefore any recipients of the emergency assistance funding would still be required to meet income eligibility requirements for needy families for non-recurrent short-term benefits. How needy, what needy is needy is defined by the tribe, and so it's the tribe that sets the income eligibility limit. And for this particular funding stream, again, to restate, the COVID-19 crisis can be viewed as a sufficient crisis that would apply to everybody that's lived and experienced COVID-19, which is everybody. So one thing I would add to that is, even though a tribe may choose to award NRSD benefits in a blanket way, where they say, okay, everybody's has experienced the crisis, but we're going to award it to those that meet an income eligibility test. They can do it that way, but if they choose, they can also administer it in a way where they specify that in order to be eligible, the family has to demonstrate how they're experiencing a specific episode of need. So there's choice and flexibility for how a tribe ultimately chooses to implement the funds. Let's go to the next slide. So with the definition that is given in the 196R, it specifies what the expenditures should include, and it also is very specific about what the expenditures may not include. So expenditures that are allowed include emergency assistance and diversion payments, emergency housing and short-term homelessness assistance, emergency food aid, short-term utility payments, burial assistance, clothing allowances, and back-to-school payments. The things that may not be purchased, or things for which expenditures may not be granted, include tax credits, child care, transportation, or short-term education and training. And in that way, these are the things that narrow the scope of this NRSD compared to what's given in the regulation. Let's go to the next slide. So tribes may have a separate definition of needy for how they're defining for needy for the Pandemic Emergency Assistance Fund when compared to the one that they're using for the non-recurring short-term benefits that they've outlined in their Tribal Family Assistance Plan or their approved 477 plan. So you're not limited by the definitions in your existing plan. You can certainly follow those if you want to, and they make sense for your tribe and for your community. But if it makes sense to use a different definition of needy specific to these funds, then that's something that a tribe can determine and choose for itself. Tribal grantees may use funds for administrative costs up to the percentage currently identified in their approved tribal TANF plan or 477 plan. So the law is silent with respect to the administrative cap, but it's silent for the administrative cap of these funds in the same way that it is for the TANF funds. And so this is one aspect of TANF that we feel applies to both. Tribal grantees must use funds to supplement and not supplant other federal, state, tribal, territorial, or local funds. So you can't use these funds to invest in something that you're currently using other funds for in order to offset those funds and then use those funds somewhere else. You can use these funds to supplement but not supplant. Let's go to the next slide, please. So there is a timeline for requesting and expending funds. First of all, tribes and territories have 90 days from enactment, and that is until June 9th, to request funds up to their maximum allotment. And an allotment request form has been distributed already, even though the slide says soon, and may be returned to a mailbox that we've set up for that particular purpose. So this is one point where let me offer a few comments about 477 tribes. We have emailed the form out to all tribes. We created a form and we received a waiver from OMB because typically any form where you're requesting information from more than 9 people or 9 organizations requires that the form go through the Paperwork Reduction Act approval process. And that's a long and arduous process, but we have to get this funding out soon. So we sought a waiver from having to complete the PRA process. So this is a form that's approved for use and tribes may use for submitting to us and indicating to us whether they want their full allotment or a portion of their allotment. The allotment, again, is given in an appendix to a program instruction that was emailed to all tribes. And for 477 tribes, you may return the form to BIA if you wish, as they are the lead organization for 477. But if you like, you may also email it directly to us and copy BIA, as that might expedite the process. For 477 tribes, we anticipate transferring funds to BIA according to the requests that we receive, and we anticipate transferring those funds on a rolling basis weekly until we've heard from all of the tribes. But no later than we need to hear from the tribes no later than June 9th. So that's the information about the request form. If you're a tribe that we fund directly for TANF, then you'll simply submit the form to us, and we'll be awarding those funds and transferring them directly to your PMS account. And so that the 477 tribes are aware, it is a little bit more of a time-intensive process to generate the transfer memo and to transfer funds to BIA. There's a few more steps involved in that than there is in simply placing it in a PMS account. But it's really just a matter of days, and we will keep BIA informed of the progress that we make as we make that progress. So the timeline for spending funds: all grantees shall expend their initial allotments between April 1st, 2021, which began 2 weeks ago. So if you've already begun spending some of the funds, it's something that you can be reimbursed for, and you must have all of the funds spent by September 30th. And the funds that are not spent, and by not spent we mean not liquidated or not obligated, those funds are subject to reallotments, and in which case they would be returned to the federal government and reallotted to those grantees that have spent all of the funding. So let's go to the next slide. So HHS will reallot any unused funds to be expended within 12 months of receipt. So OFA will reallot any funding not allotted in the original issuance of awards. So if you look at the table, the allotment table that has already been sent, if you choose to submit and ask for something less than what is in that table, then the portion that you are not asking for would become available to reallotment to all the other grantees. And also money that's not spent at the end of fiscal year 2022 would also become subject to the reallotment. It is our intention at this point in time to only do one reallotment that would take into account all of those funds. And we'll share more information as that approaches. But the important thing to be aware of is that you really just have a one-time opportunity to request all of the funding of your allotment, and that needs to be done prior to June 9th. So let's go to the next slide. So then question is the next, or reporting is the next question. And for those tribes that we fund directly, those tribes will report their expenditure data on a quarterly report that's going to use a revised version of the 196T that they're currently using. And one field, there's really just a few fields of information here that are relevant. One will show the amount that's been awarded, and that should be automatically populated. And then the other two fields that are going to be important to report on is the amount of funding that you spent on administrative costs and the amount that you spent on non-recurrent short-term benefits related to this particular funding. Those are the only two things that are allowable by these funds, and those are the two fields that need to be reported. So let's go and talk, let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about reporting for 477 tribes. So at this point, we don't have the guidance nailed down for what 477 tribes are to do. We'll be giving further consideration to the frequency, the form to be used, and the mechanism for reporting. But what we want to do for sure is make sure that the requirements of the law are met, while also making sure that we're taking into account the kinds of concerns that were expressed by 477 tribes in the consultation process. For the purposes of, even in the absence of that guidance that will be forthcoming, there are some things that the 477 tribes will want to keep in mind that hold true for them, just as they do for the tribes that are funded directly. The funds may only be used for NRST benefits. Grantees must use funds to supplement and not supplant other funds. The negotiated administrative cost cap is what is in the 477 plan, and the same time limits for expenditures apply. So even though we don't have a reporting form or mechanism, or can't say very much about that, we do know that you need to track the expenditures related to NRST benefits and administrative costs that you spent in relation to these funds, because when that data is reported to us, it will be used to determine the amount of funds remaining for reallotment by all grantees. And so it's important that you be tracking those as we go along, even though we don't have clear guidance at this point as to how that data should be reported. So I believe that concludes the overview. And so let's go to questions. And Deborah, I hope you've been tracking things, because I have not.
Yeah, we've gotten a bunch of great questions in, so thank you for that presentation. And I will start sharing some of the questions that we've gotten in for you to respond to. Actually, we got this from a couple of participants wondering if the definition of needy can be different for these funds than it is for the regular TANF program. And if so, do the tribes need to do a plan amendment or any other kind of approval to change the definition of needy for this fund?
That's a great question, and they may use a different definition for needy for the purposes of this funding than what they use as a part of what they have in their approved TANF plan or their approved 477 plan. It may be different, and in fact, you could potentially have be awarding two kinds of NRSD benefits with this funding, and each one of those benefits would have a different definition of needy. So there's a lot of flexibility, and even if you use something different, a plan amendment is not required in either case for TANF or for the 477 plan.
Great, thanks. There's also a question about if tribes are restricted to the same service area as noted in the 477 plan. Can we assist our tribal families that reside outside our usual service areas?
So that's a very good question, and it's probably something we want to be more thoughtful about and put something into writing about. But I'll tell you, I'll give you at least a preview of where our thinking is going with that. And that is, we did issue a program instruction about TANF benefits and how they might be extended to individuals beyond your TANF service area. And we came to the conclusion that it was okay to do so, that a tribe could provide benefits to their own members. So you couldn't provide benefits to members outside of your own tribe or members of the tribal coalition that you represent, but you could provide members outside of your service area with benefits. But there is an obligation to ensure that they're not receiving the same benefit from another human service agency. So essentially they wouldn't be double dipping, so that they get the benefit from the tribe as well as the benefit because they happen to be a citizen of the state and the state is doing the same thing. So I hope that makes sense.
There was another question, if we could provide an example of what a back to school payment would be. That was listed as one of the examples.
So I think a back to school payment, and Susan might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that there have been instances in the past of grantees providing back to school supplies for children and youth returning to school and using TANF funds to provide for those. And in this case, it would be the Pandemic Emergency Assistance Funds that could be used for those kinds of things.
And I would just add, Stan, that in this case, it is that a family is having difficulty purchasing supplies and whatever the child needed to go back to school because of the pandemic. Again, I think it's important to remember that expenditures are related to needs caused by the pandemic. So just that clarification.
Great. There's another question. Is there any situation where you can assist applicants that do not have children in the home with these non-recurrent short-term benefits through this program?
I think that for the most part, I think we're thinking that the funds will be used for families with children. If they could be specific and put their question into writing and share it with either their BIA AOTR or their regional specialist, then I think that we could provide a more precise answer to that question.
Okay, another question we may need a more precise answer to, but there's a question about, since the non-recurrent short-term benefits have a 4-month limit, but the Pandemic Emergency Assistance Fund spending can go through the end of fiscal year 2022, could a family exhaust the 4 months and then after a period of time re-qualify for an additional 4 months of a benefit? And if so, how much time would pass in between?
So I think that, and Susan may have to clarify or jump in here too, but my understanding is that it's 4 months within the 12-month period. And so if you were to come in for the same non-recurrent short-term benefit, then you would need to wait until the following year. I think it would be possible to think about how there may be a different non-recurring short-term benefit that a person would qualify within the period of a year. So for example, if a tribe created a system in which they provided assistance for utilities for people that had difficulty meeting their utility bills as a result of the pandemic, and then they were to do another non-recurrent short-term benefit that provided back to school supplies for families that were having difficulty providing meeting the schooling needs of their children, then they could do, those would be 2 separate non-recurrent short-term benefits, and those could be received within the period of a year.
So like you said, we probably will have to follow up on the question about having children at home, because there is a comment that 477 programs have families who are eligible for services who do not have children in the home, and question about if burial assistance expenditures would qualify even if there aren't children in the home. So that's probably something we'll have to get back to.
Yeah.
Other questions?
And let me just add one thing to that we'll want to be taking into consideration too, is that in tribal plans, the tribes define what's meant by family, and so that may be a factor in our decision in thinking about that. But we'll definitely give that more thought very soon.
Great. There's a question, can these funds be used to purchase internet service and laptops for families as a utility?
So that's a good question, and thank you for sharing that. I think that is another question that we'll want to be more thoughtful about in the days ahead. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to provide some written guidance in relation to that soon. One of the things that I think that we can say with confidence is that the NRST funds, like any TANF fund, and a little different from TANF funds. So TANF funds may be used for any TANF purpose, but as we have come to understand the purpose of this funding, we believe that this funding needs to be aligned with purpose 1 of TANF, and so it would be important for tribes in whatever expenditures they're considering that they would be able to tie the IT costs or the IT expenditures to a purpose 1 activity.
Okay, and there's a couple questions coming in about whether it is HHS's belief that the regulations are superseding the 477 law.
So that's a good question, and for the Pandemic Emergency Assistance Fund, we actually haven't regulated. There are TANF regulations, and arguably some of them do apply, but virtually all of the requirements that I've talked about in relation to the Pandemic Emergency Assistance Fund are derived directly from the law, and the law is explicit that it applies to states, territories, and tribes, and they apply to both those that we fund directly as well as those that incorporate their activities through a 477 plan.
I should mention, and they specifically mentioned shelf life and reporting in those questions. So we can.
And one of the primary things, so the shelf life and the reporting, the law is very explicit that funds not spent by the end of fiscal year 2022 become subject to a reallotment process, and the reporting that we will be requiring, the requirements for that reporting are really derived by the fact that we have to have some means of determining how much funding is available for reallotment. So that's kind of where we're coming from there, and so in that respect, there is a shelf life, and there will be some reporting requirements, though the frequency, the forms, and the mechanism for that reporting is yet to be determined.
Thanks. There's a question about whether these pandemic emergency assistance funds would be counted as income, for example, when figuring out a SNAP benefit.
So that's a good question, and I don't know for sure what the answer to that is. What I would encourage tribes to do is to follow up with SNAP and ask them. In the case of TANF, there's often flexibility how other funding sources are regarded. What was nice about some of the CARES Act funding that came out previously is it was very specific that the funding was not eligible to be counted against a person for means-tested programs. But I'm not sure that it was clear in the same way for this. I don't know, Susan, if you have anything else that you would want to add to that.
I don't know for sure. It's a question we just, I think, got as well yesterday. I think so. I think issues arise perhaps around SNAP, and particularly SNAP. So we will have to look into that, because I don't know, and I don't know if any of our other staff members know that yet either. They do chime in. There we go.
I'm fairly certain SNAP does not count non-recurrent short-term benefits as income or as assets for a year. But again, we need official confirmation from FNS, but it is in their regulations.
Thanks.
That was Peter Germanis, National TANF expert, and thank you for chiming in.
Thanks.
So,
do you want to?
let's take, if you have one more, let's take it, but then let's open up the phone line.
Okay, great. There's a bunch of questions, but perhaps people can ask them on the phone. And if we don't get to all your questions, we'll make sure to follow up after the webinar. There were some questions about the blanket benefit enhancement you had mentioned. If you could expand on that, and I guess this is similar to what we were saying before. If you received a blanket benefit enhancement, could the same family also receive another emergency benefit?
Sure. So to go back to the idea of a blanket benefit, the idea there is that everybody has we've kind of made some distinctions between an episode of need and a crisis situation. In our view, the COVID-19 pandemic constitutes a crisis. That's why this legislation was passed, in order to provide relief for that. And so in that sense, if people have lived and endured the COVID-19 pandemic, then they have been subject to a crisis. But there are two criteria when thinking about awarding a non-recurrent short-term benefit. And so one is if a person has experienced a crisis or an episode of need. And number two is if they are eligible in terms of income. So even though we can say as a blanket that everybody has experienced COVID-19, it's possible, it's more than likely that not everybody has been impacted in a dramatic financial way where they would not meet the income eligibility to receive a non-recurrent short-term benefit. And so it's still important to establish what the income eligibility is. It should be what the tribe defines as needy, and but there's not a federal prescription for what needy means. So I think that was there was another part. Oh, the other part was whether a person could get this blanket non-recurrent short-term benefit and also receive another. And I do think that there could be instances where somebody receives a blanket, quote unquote, blanket benefit, as well as then be eligible for, say, a back to school voucher or supplies or something like that. So, Steve, if you haven't already, can you open up the phone lines just so we can spend a few minutes hearing from people? And we'll take till 5 o'clock, but then questions that we don't get to, please direct them to your BIA AOTR or your regional program specialist, and we'll filter questions that way. Looks like we have 131 people on the line. If you don't have an immediate question to ask, that's totally fine. And go ahead and mute your own phone. But if you do, unmute your line and feel free to express yourself. Deborah, did we have any other questions on the?
We do. It did seem like people wanted to, I don't know if it's an issue with muting and unmuting.
Dan, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is Chairman Denver Bishop Paiute Tribe, also on the Valley Board of Trustees, which manages OVCDC. I have a question. In our case here at Bishop, we still have our emergency declaration still in order. Does that have any impact on any of these services?
So I'm not sure that it does. I mean, the most significant thing is that this funding has been authorized in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and so I don't know that any other declaration of emergency carries greater weight or additional significance, I think it's sufficient that this funding has been authorized in response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Because I know on other fundings, the tribes are getting, some of the funding has required that emergency declaration. So I was just wondering.
Yeah, there's not we don't require a declaration. We do require that you submit to us your request for funding. Beyond that, there's not a plan amendment that you need to do. We do suggest that you maintain good records because this funding, like any funding, would be subject to audit. But there's not much in terms of paperwork that we require.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Speaking of the request form being due by June 9th, there was a question about, once that comes in, when does the money come to the tribe?
So that's a good question. So I think that we're planning to award funds generally on a weekly basis. And so in some ways it depends when the form is received by us and then shared with our colleagues in OGM. Generally, for those that we fund directly, I would say it's a matter of a few days. And for those where we're transferring funds to BIA, that probably requires a couple of more days on our end, because it's not just a matter of notifying our Office of Grants Management, but they have to notify some additional offices as well as then transfer the funds to BIA, and then BIA needs to make the award. And so it'll be a few more days for the 477 tribes than it will be for those that we fund directly.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so the application or the form that we have to fill out now, is that for okay, so I'm under 477 program, the administrator of the cash assistance with children in the past TANF. So does that come from myself, my director, or the council?
That's a great question. For tribes, we are requiring that they have their tribal chairman or the chief executive of the tribe. So it doesn't need to go to the council or have council approval, but we do want the signature of the tribal chief executive just to sign the form.
Okay, thank you. And then I have just one more question.
Sure.
So I was taking the pictures of the slides, and so if we were to apply and then we receive the funds, now this is meaning, and tribal or the TANF purpose one is to keep to keep children in their home and for basic assistance like utilities, rent, things like that. So, like, would the client have to come in and request that, or can we just? I mean, we need to spend these funds in a certain amount of time, so can we just assist them with that, like rent and utilities, or would they request it? Request that.
That sounds great.
Yeah. So that's a good question. There's a couple of So number one, you're right that so the purpose one is to provide assistance to needy families so that children can be cared for in their own homes or in the homes of relatives. And even on the slides, many of the things that funds could be used for, there's a clear tie between paying for rent and being able to keep children in their own home, because if you're not making rent, then the entire family is potentially displaced. And so, so yes, the funds may be used for a wide range of activities that fulfill purpose one. The second part of your question had to do with eligibility determinations, and there's probably a couple of different ways of making that determination. There may be families that are already participating in a means-tested program, and by virtue of their participation in that,
what you would do to encourage openness and understanding while still ensuring that your expectations are being.
Jarrett, hurry up, man! It stinks in here.
So if you could mute your line if you don't have a question. I'm going to have a hard time competing against background noise.
Just to connect as a team
and
get everyone on board with the overall vision and purpose of why we're there.
Mute everyone, and I can ask some more questions in the chat.
You can mute all of them for a moment.
I know different.
Okay, so I just unmuted myself, but lots of others have been muted. There were two parts of the question that were asked, and I spoke to the first part. The second part has to do with determining eligibility. And the question was like, does every family have to come in and do a particular test and then be granted some kind of benefit? And as we've thought about it, there may be a variety of ways in which you do eligibility determinations. You may have families that have already passed, essentially, an eligibility test by virtue of the fact that they're receiving TANF or they're receiving SNAP, or they may be participating in some other means-tested program. And you may choose to provide a non-recurrent short-term benefit to all of the families that have already met the eligibility requirements for a particular program, and that would save you the step of having to do individual or family determinations of eligibility on a case-by-case basis.
There's a couple questions that people wrote in. Peter may be able to help with these around the 4-month period, whether that's 4 consecutive months, whether it's 4 months in a 12-month period, whether it's 4 months in a calendar year. So there's some confusion around that. I don't know if Peter, you're able to help with that.
I don't think there's a 12-month period per se, but it is intended to be for 4 months or less. So it's not intended to be like ongoing assistance. So you have to think of it as a short-term need. Now, that need or some other need may come up again. And so you could conceivably have a second non-recurrent short-term benefit. I think we may have to think a little bit about like how much time would have to elapse between 2 identical non-recurrent short-term benefits. But certainly if there are different benefits, there's no need for, they could even overlap. But they are intended to be short-term. That's the main thing to keep in mind. Otherwise, it substitutes for assistance.
And if a family has timed out of assistance from a state MOE fund or federal funds, they could still receive a non-recurrent short-term benefit through this program, correct?
Yes.
And Peter, I saw a question that asked, instead of doing a 1 lump sum for 4 months, could they increase TANF benefits to families for 4 months in a row? So it's 4 1-month benefit additions.
I think we'd have to see a little bit more about why it would be for 4 months. Again, it's intended to be short-term and not ongoing. If you're paying something monthly, that sort of sounds like it's ongoing. That's not to say you couldn't do it, but I think it'd be good to sort of check in with us before doing something like that.
There's a question about spending caps, for example, on the back to school funds or other things. Would there be a cap on what the benefit could be?
No.
There is an administrative cap, but there is not a cap for the amount associated with the NRSD benefit itself. So we've only got a few minutes remaining. Let's try opening the lines just one more time and see if there's any other questions that we might receive that way.
This is Holly Morales. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. I kind of wanted to revisit the non-recurring short-term assistance and kind of what you guys talked about, because in the regulations, it doesn't really specify, like Peter mentioned, a 12-month period, but I think the definition in itself talks about it not going over the 4 months. So that would be considered short term. And it doesn't give you any kind of limitation as far as how many times a crisis can happen. And so I guess my concern is opinions versus what the actual law and regulations say. And so a lot of times what happens is our participants will come in for different crises, like layoff versus getting COVID, or a family member's COVID, or they have to quarantine with their child because of classroom being exposed and things like that. I would consider, if there's a break in service, that those could all be considered different episodes of need.
Yes. And the idea about the 4 months is it's intended to be 4 months or less. We did have situations where some needs unexpectedly extended beyond that period, and the state still provided the non-recurrent short-term benefit for the 4-month period. But you know, a lot of it is a judgment call, but it's supposed to be for things that are expected to be short-term.
And what Holly laid out were, I consider them to be distinct episodes of need, right? Each incident you described was different. The family needed assistance because something else had happened, so that was fine. And Peter had even said they could potentially be overlapping if you know, something happened closely after the first incident.
So my clock says 4:59, and not hearing anybody just go for the phone, let me take this time to just express my appreciation for everybody that was able to join. And again, this isn't the final conversation. If you have questions, please direct those questions to your BIA AOTRs or your TANF regional program specialist. And there's going to be more information to come as we continue to give consideration to reporting. And similarly for all tribes and all grantees, there will be further information that comes regarding reallotment and things like that. So we're excited to be at the beginning of this, and we hope that you agree that there's at least an immediate clear path forward, and we look forward to receiving from you requests for funds. And if we may be of additional assistance in any way, please let us know. Special thanks from me go to Susan Golonka, Deborah List, and Peter Germanis for their assistance on this call. And we look forward to remaining connected with all of you, so please stay in touch. Thanks, take care, and have a great afternoon.